Okay, so those who don't know me, I've seen a couple of names that I do recognise. My name's Karen Mosley. I'm the Director of Professional Standards and Complaints with ACSL, and I'm going to be helping out by facilitating this session. We've got Kat and Kendra, both as well, going to be helping out with some of the admin, letting people into the rooms, help out with the chats and things like that as well. If you need any help or there's anything going wrong, feel free to jump onto the chat and let one of us know and we can help out. Before we get going, I just wanted to say I recognise that I'm facilitating this session from Bundjalung country, but I also recognise the traditional custodians of the various lands in which you're joining from today. We honour the First Nations people, culture and connection to land, sea and community, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. For today's session, pleased to introduce Dr. Simon Longstaff. Simon is the Executive Director of the Ethics Centre and in 2013 was made an Officer of the Order of Australia for distinguished service to the community through the promotion of ethical standards in governance and business. And I think I got all those words right. Simon's session today will be focusing on dignity and safeguarding. While Simon will do some of the talking from the start, we really do want this to be engaging and we want it to be relevant to you. So we really encourage you to raise your hand through Zoom and raise a question or a scenario that you can work through during the session. With that being said, you're here to see Simon, not me, so I will pass on to him.
Thank you, Karen, and hello, everybody. Very nice to be with you today. I'm coming from the lands of the Camaragal people. I just like to equally acknowledge their stewardship of the things of the land, the sea and the air for millennia, and to pay my respects to the elders. I should explain that in talking about dignity and safeguarding, I'm not just going to be touching on philosophical questions, although they will certainly inform part of what I want to say, but I'm also going to venture a little bit into some theological questions. And I should explain that I was in the tender care of the Jesuits for a number of years. So any sort of things you think are a bit off, I mean, you can blame them later on. But if you want to jump in at any point and say, hang on, what about this or what about that? Please feel free to do so. And certainly after I've offered a few opening remarks to, if you like, set the scene. What I hope to do is to be able to work with you to address the actual issues you encounter, rather than me speculate about what they might be. And I've had a few things sent forward that suggest the kind of territory which is probably relevant. But if you'd like to jump in with a question, a comment or a challenge even, it's just a matter of using that little hand-raising device, and I'll pause as soon as I see that, or one of the others who are running the program will just let me know that there's a hand there in case I don't see it. We can do that. So I don't want you to feel that you've just got to let me go on when you've got something really burning as an issue in your own mind. It's better to stop, talk about it, and as I say, ultimately to address the questions and concerns that you have. But let's start at the beginning with why I think there's a potential tension between dignity and safeguarding. It doesn't have to be, just it's a potential for it. And particularly try and locate that within a larger tradition, and particularly a tradition within Catholic theology and social teaching. So the notion of intrinsic, as I think everybody here would know, and by the way, what I'm going to say, I think it will be pretty obvious to you too. So it's just a matter of not saying that it's anything new. It's really about laying it out in order to see where the tensions arise. The idea of the intrinsic dignity of the person has always been a strong feature of Catholic thinking. And there are a couple of elements in that which are not always immediately obvious. For example, the notion of what constitutes a person is an ethically significant category. It's distinct from a biological or other kind of category. It's that kind of being that can bear the full rights and responsibilities accorded to persons as opposed to non-persons. And for humans who fall within the class of persons, the reason for their traditionally having had a sense of intrinsic dignity, within the Christian tradition at least, it goes back to, and the Hebraic tradition really, it goes back to this idea of being made in the image of God. Now, of course, that begs the question, what does that actually mean? And there have been various thoughts about it, but if you go back to the earliest sources, the Hebrew sources, to be made in the image of God is to be made in the moral image of God. That is, to be endowed with what is most intrinsic to that moral being, which is the capacity to exercise free will. And there are some people who argue, for example, that the first genuine act of creation that takes place in the biblical account of creation is in fact the creation of humanity, because all things that came before were merely made out of the existing substance that was God. Whereas for the first time, something genuinely new and original is created when a being is brought into existence, which has the capacity to choose for itself. In other words, it can make a decision other than that which the Godhead would itself make. And of course, endowing humans with free will then gives rise to the whole story about the Garden of Eden and the possibility of good and evil and all the rest. But it's that factor, that element, that we have this capacity to exercise free will that is the source, if you like, of the intrinsic dignity that humans have, that divine-like capacity. And in fact, within the annals of theology and Catholic social teaching, probably the most significant expression of that, which still resonates to this day with an absolute force, is the work undertaken by St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, where he conceived of humans as possessing this kind of divine spark, a direct insight into that element of God, such that the most authoritative guide to conduct in life was one's own well-informed conscience. That is, if you'd like, I'll put it in my terms, maybe not the church's terms, that there is the sovereignty of the individual's well-informed conscience, and no authority, not even a pope's, has superior sway over that of the individual conscience, the well-informed conscience. Now, of course, the magisterium makes a claim to be able to help that conscience to be well-informed, and as my friend Frank Brennan would put it, equally to be a well-formed conscience. But even as I say to this day, right throughout all of the church councils, nothing has supplanted the work that Aquinas set and established that as the basic principle, which of course is an affirmation of the very source of human dignity itself. The problem with that, though, as everybody knows, is the old problem about, well, what happens when the well-informed conscience of the individual comes into conflict with what might be human-made dictates, norms, laws, rules, and all the rest. How do we square that away? Whether those rules and laws are made by Caesar, where we are to render unto Caesar, or where the boundaries are there. For example, you know, the famous cases in the early parts of the church, and perhaps even to this day, of martyrdom, where people prefer to stick to what their conscience requires of them, even to the point of death. These tensions have always been there, because if you are endowed with free will, and if your conscience, your well-informed conscience, is the ultimate guide to conduct, then there will be times when you come up against either secular or clerical or canon rules, laws, which are at odds. And that's particularly because those can often reflect temporal concerns of the moment. So we all know, for example, that even in Australia in the 19th century, there were laws against miscegenation, that certainly in Victoria, where it was a crime for a person to cohabit with an Aboriginal woman, for a white man to do that. It was no more just or proper such a law than the laws around apartheid in South Africa. There have been laws at the time aiming towards things like conscription, and or at least attempts to do that. And there have been people who've been conscientious objectors who've said, as a mark of my conscientious objection, not merely do I object and I will not comply, but I'm willing to suffer penalties of that, which have ranged, as I say, through history all the way from things like imprisonment and sometimes worse, torture, and even unto death. So you'll find these tensions occurring in church history. They occur in the relationships between a faithful believer exercising their conscience and the secular powers. It's a very common thing, but it's also something which arises inside the church itself, as it does within any institution. And this is particularly the case, I think, when you find circumstances in which the church as an institution or any institution starts to respond to the kind of pressures that exist, often with good justifiable reasons, because of the conduct of some or many or an institutional set of settings, such that the organisation says we must respond by instituting a more deliberate and more directive framework of principles and even rules for how we and others within our fold will conduct ourselves. And those can be made, that is, those principles enunciated and the rules made with perfectly good reasons in a responsible and responsive way to circumstances. But they can also come to a point where they start to take on a kind of life of their own, which is not necessarily responsive to the immediate requirements that, say, a recognition of intrinsic dignity would call for. And when this happens, this tension, when you have between, if you like, well-founded rules, even rules which are demanded by a whole society, and what actually might be the best response to a person in terms of their dignity, this presents a real ethical dilemma. And of course, the tough ethical choices in life are not between really good and bad and right and wrong. They're usually pretty straightforward. It's when the choice is between good versus good, right versus right. That is the nature of the kind of dilemma that can arise quite frequently, actually, in ordinary life. And I'll just give you a somewhat prosaic example of this, away from the immediate issues we're talking about. But you can imagine someone you love comes home one day with a new haircut or new clothes or something, and they say, "Tell me, what do you look? What do you think?" And you look at them, and your reaction, your honest reaction, is, "Oh no, this is what a disaster." But you also know, if you told them the truth, that they'd be hurt. And you can be a person who believes with equal commitment, both in truth and in compassion. And so one force, the force towards truth, is pulling you in 10 units of force in one direction, and then the equal and opposite reaction, the force of compassion, is pulling you in the opposite way. And there you are, where in principle, and this is a serious philosophical point, in principle, the question of what to do is undecidable, because 10 versus 10, it provides the null result. And yet you still have to respond. You might just walk up and give them a hug. I don't know. But that's the sort of situation which is the actual difficult one that causes all sorts of problems when people are conscious of it. Of course, the situation is not always so obvious, and ethical failure can often arise not because of anybody wrestling with this and finding it impossible in principle to decide. It can also be a source when otherwise good people do bad things without ever intending to do so. And in my estimation, so much of what goes wrong in the world and which has an adverse impact on the lives of people is not actually the product of people who deliberately intend to be wicked, but rather it falls into that class or category where basically good people have made bad choices, done bad things. And how does that happen? Well, when you talk to people who've been right at the beginning of various forms of ethical failure in institutions or in individual life, and you ask them to tell you a bit about what occurred, the first thing that becomes clear, and I've been talking to people like this for over 30 years now, is that they will tell you quite truthfully and sincerely that at the time they made their decision, they didn't see it. They honestly didn't see it. And you ask, well, why didn't you see it? And their response is, well, everybody was doing it. That's just the way things were done. And so there's a kind of conditioned blindness that can befall us, such that we no longer actually recognise the truth of what is before us, the distinctive characteristics of it. Instead, we habitually follow a set of practices and customs, which become dangerous not because they were originally poorly conceived, but because they have simply become a matter of habit. It's a bit like a person who habitually sort of sets off, let's suppose they're in a fitness regime and they begin a kind of walk or a run around an area, and they've picked a pretty nice route where they go down by a stream and then across a field, and then they come back to their home, and they get absolutely ingrained into this. They wake up at the same time, they pop on their shoes and off they go on this route. So fixed are they at the habit of running this course that they don't notice over time that the stream becomes polluted, that there's a vicious dog living on a corner, until something bad happens. Because they were conditioned, they didn't look at it, they were in the habit. And this is a really important distinction about the role that habit plays, because it helps to explain what is different between a moral life and an ethical life. So the core question of ethics, which is ascribed in the Western tradition to Socrates, is this question: what ought one to do? Faced with a choice, faced with a decision, whether it's about whether to buy free-range eggs when you're at the supermarket looking as to what kind of eggs to buy, those which are for the birds that wander free in the world, or those that are locked up in cages and there's a price difference from all this. That's a question: what should one do? Through to whether or not you're trying to attempt to rescue children trapped in a flood. They're in the house as the floodwaters rise, or any one of these questions. What ought one to do? It's a practical question where you need to answer questions with regard to time and pressure and all the rest. A question that's asked of every choice we make. What ought one to do is the question. Now, throughout history, the answer to that question has been put into sets of packages where it comes pre-formed. So there is a Christian answer, a Catholic, let's say be even more specific, a Roman Catholic answer to the questions of what ought one to do. And it's in a little box, and you open up the box, and what do you find in it? You find some core values, some principles, some revealed truths, some exemplary lives, all of those, just as there's a Jewish box, an Islamic box, and you can go through all the great religions that have got little preformed box. And there are philosophers like utilitarianism and other things of that kind, another little box. And every one of those boxes is carrying a label, morality, because you can live the moral life by opening the box in response to the question, what ought one to do? And there it's all laid out for you, which is a very helpful and handy thing. And from the moment we are born as humans, we tend to be inducted into these moral worlds through families, through churches, through communities. Now, the thing about a moral life is that you can apply those core values and principles and follow those precepts and exemplary lives merely as a matter of habit, because that's how you've been raised to do, or conditioned to do it. So one can be habitually truthful and kind and generous and all the rest. But that is a lesser life than the ethical life. Because the ethical life, going back to people like Aquinas and this concept of being made in the image of God, is a life in which one brings to bear one's capacity for reflective practice. That is why the precept about the well-informed conscience takes priority. It goes back to that other claim of Socrates, that the unexamined life is not worth living. That is, that for our form of being, for the form of being in which we participate, human being, as opposed to ant being or cow being or lion being, we are distinguished by our ability to go beyond that which is driven by our animal nature, namely to act in accordance with instinct and desire. And instead, we're endowed with this capacity to make conscious choices, to make the ethical choice. Now, to go back to where I started, some people account for this capacity by the theological account that we're made in the image of God. There are other people who just take a socio-biological figure and they say, well, you just look at evolution and history and whatever else you might say, this is something which is an emergent capacity of consciousness and all the rest. In a sense, it doesn't matter. I mean, you could have the theological and scientific debates and they will matter in their own terms, but for the sake of discussing ethics, there is a kind of this worldly observation that all of us can make about the other, that we do have this ability to go beyond instinct and desire. So although a lion on the veldt hunting an impala almost certainly does not say to itself, oh gosh, I am hungry, but what about its children? And not hunt it. They just catch it, kill it, and eat it. There are, even as I'm speaking now, human beings who are starving, who will have close by to them a source of nourishment, and no one is observing them, no one is going to restrain them, and yet they do not take it simply because they know that it is not theirs, it is someone else's. And there are people facing the most terrible circumstances where if they were an animal alone, they would run away, they would seek shelter, and they're not guarding or protecting their own family or their property. They stand there and face it, like maybe somebody in Ukraine at the moment, simply because they made a promise to do so. It's that ability, that ethical ability to live an examined life, which is distinctive of our form of being. And so when people say, oh, I did it, I didn't see it because that's just the way we did things back then, what they're almost certainly doing is giving you a moral account of the circumstances in which they found themselves, where much like the habitual person who runs around the same route even as the environment changes, they don't see it because they don't look, because they don't need to, because they've not exercised that capacity that Aquinas and others have spoken to live that fully human life, to live the examined life, the life of a well-informed conscience. And of course, this brings us back to some of these challenges about institutional responses to ethical failure, because what they will often do is put in place rules, regulations, principles that become another part of the moral framework by which an institution responds, which begins with a fully reflective capacity, but itself is at risk of becoming yet another part of the habits of morality, the moral response. And so that is the moment when the danger begins to arise afresh, because a person again might say, well, I did this, I didn't see it at the time, because that's just the way we did things. That's the way the rules prescribed, the principles applied, the unthinking custom and practice of the day emerged. And that can happen even in response to the claims of human dignity. That's where the danger happens. That's where the tension arises, when a person fully present before you is unable completely to be seen. Not because you don't care, I'm not saying you personally, not because the institution doesn't care, but because it's fallen foul of this tendency to instantiate our customs and practices into a point where they start to become unthinking custom and practices. And at some point, that's where the danger begins to mount. Now, it may not be realised in any particular moment, it may be over decades or whatever, but that's the danger lurking. Now, you might ask yourself, well, wow, okay, what's the antidote? And the antidote has, I've sort of, in a sense, been talking about those people who are the conscientious objectors, but even if you don't quite get to that point, the antidote lies in a particular kind of leadership, which is not necessarily linked to any hierarchical position, but it's a model of leadership which I call constructive subversion. Now, what is constructive subversion? Well, firstly, let's start with a distinction between what a person in management and leadership might do. Let's imagine we're all on a cork, we're all on a stream, we're flowing along, and one of the things we do not want to do is to fall into the stream. So there's a whole lot of people who make sure that the cork stays upright. They run around and they push buttons, pull levers, and basically it keeps it steady. But the one thing about this group is that they will have nothing to do with where the cork is travelling, because the cork will travel where the stream happens to take them. Whereas leaders, in distinction, play an equally vital role. So management's essential in that sense, but the leadership function is to impart direction. In other words, not simply to go where the stream happens to be flowing. And that's why the job of the constructive subversive, that is the leader, because I think this is truly what leadership is to actually subvert, that is to undermine unthinking custom and practice itself. A leader, whatever their hierarchical position, the person, if you like, engaging in leadership, will always challenge why something is done and never accept that it is done merely in order because it's just the way we do things, or everybody does it, or whatever, they will actually subvert that tendency, but not to destroy the joint, nor to impose their own idiosyncratic view of the world onto the organisation. Instead, they do this in service of the organisation, helping to become the thing that it says it wants to be. That's why it's constructive. Now, to do this, some people think, oh, well, there are two extremes that I need to employ in my own personal engagement with the organisation in my context. Some people think that they have to throw themselves onto the funeral pyre of integrity at the earliest opportunity. You know, as soon as they see something which challenges, jump onto the fire, and there they go, whoosh. And there are some beautiful sparks and people applaud and all the rest, but then all that's left is the cinders and ash at the end. That's one view. Other people think, oh no, being ethical in this sense is like being a little rabbit, you know. People will come along and they'll pat you and they say, isn't that nice, soft and fluffy and ethical? And there it sits, being patted on the roadway of life while a great big truck called reality is bearing down. And they say, oh, well, they're destined to be roadkill, you know. And neither of those choices is what you want when you encounter these dilemmas. Instead, what the ethical leader seeks to do is to be brave and nimble and to be particularly creative, to be able to find or to create inflection points. That is, not to take the world as fixed, not even your world within an institutional setting, but instead to be in circumstances where you say there is a certain plasticity to the world. Not everything is going to be like truth versus compassion. Sometimes we can change our stance. Sometimes we can change a factor. Sometimes we can create a new way of relating to this. Sometimes it might be about forming allies or framing a proposition in a way which resonates with people so that they say, oh, yes, I get it. There's all sorts of things to be done. So if I just sort of wrap this up as a kind of the introduction before we get into a conversation about this, I think there is a potential, not necessary, but potential challenge between the demands of intrinsic dignity, which is to be seen in and of yourself, a dignity which accords with one's status as a being that is capable of living an examined life, that within the Catholic tradition comes from being made in the image of God, to be endowed with that divine capacity to exercise free will, so significant that it lives within the breast of each human, to the point where Aquinas accords this special capacity to exercise sovereignty of the well-informed conscience. And that demand to be seen in those terms as a person, a particular kind of being, the person, the one with this full range of moral rights and responsibilities, can at times become invisible or diminished or blurred to some degree as we start to apply frameworks of rules and regulations and practices, systems and policies and structures, all of which can be well-founded, all of which are built about, but which can actually take on the moral tones of habits to the point where we no longer see the person before us. And I think the answer to that then is to not merely allow, but to insist on the leadership that is constructively subversive, which sits alongside a culture of curiosity, not speaking up, because that sounds a bit dangerous and it's usually about bad things, but to build the culture of curiosity where people wonder about why we do what we do and how do we not become conditioned in a way not to see what is before us. And perhaps with that as the introductory framing of where the problem might arise, first of all, we can say, is anybody who wants me to clarify what I think about this because it wasn't clear, or who wants to challenge what I think about it because you think it's a misrepresentation or an absence of something? Or do you want to start talking, perhaps, if you've got some thoughts about how this might apply within your world and where you might have seen or currently do see some of these factors at work? If I remind you, if you want to jump in, just raise the hand and we'll go from there. And there we go.
It looks like Maria's got her hand up.
Okay, so maybe I don't know if you need still to have me spotlighted. You might want to just go back to the gallery and we can all see each other.
Yeah.
I'm happy just to chat at one place amongst many. So, Maria, I can't see you at the moment on this, the way it's set up, but
That's
you want to
probably
have a
because
crack?
that's fine. It's just because I've not got my video closed. Simon, thank you. Given that most of us, whilst working in Catholic environments, actually live in a very secular world, I was thinking about whether you would use the word autonomy at all rather than the just dignity, because I find working in a secular world, once I talk about the autonomy, the right to autonomy, when we talk about dignity of risk, it resonates more than when I talk about dignity in faith-based terms. So I just wondered if you would comment
Yeah,
on that.
I can understand that. If it was me, I'd be trying to use both terms, I think, and maintain the connection between them. I think otherwise autonomy can float a little bit. It doesn't have its grounding. And it is an important concept and people will understand that. But I think that the concept of the dignity of the person is broader than just autonomy. I think it captures a lot more about what it means to be a person. So I think from a tactical point of view, you're right to say, look, we need to frame it in ways that resonate with people, because it's pointless using language that people either reject or can't understand. But the educative function of explaining why autonomy has a deeper root is something I would encourage.
Yeah, I agree with you entirely. Just working in a secular world, I find it's much harder.
Well, one thing you can try, and I sort of alluded to this, is that Socratic move about what is distinctive about being human, namely that ability to go beyond just the animal impulse of instinct and desire. And one doesn't have to be in a religious context to see that that's true. I mean, you can set that aside and at least have people recognise, for whatever reason, as I say, you can offer a theological or a purely scientific reason, that it is, as I say, a this worldly fact that one can recognise, and that there is something about participating in that form of being, which is, as I say, is distinct from the form of being of a cow or an ant or a lion, as I talked about. And my experience is that people can get that. They can say, oh, yeah, I see that now. There is something pretty special about being human. And I don't have to sort of invest in a particular account of that to recognise that significance. And then you get closer to the notion of why dignity is intrinsic in that sense.
Thank you.
Thanks, Maria. Does anyone else have anything they wanted to jump in with, or any areas they thought it would be good to link into what they're doing?
Well, I mean, my question then back to, I mean, maybe as you think, and I hope I'm not going to cause you to be nervous or embarrassed about this at all, but is I'd really love to know if you've seen this, or you currently see it even, where there is a tension, or do you think the tension doesn't exist in any practical sense?
I think Peter, you had your hand up. You're on mute. Did you want to jump in? You just need to unmute. Sorry, Peter.
Here I go. Hello. Simon, thank you. I'm assisting the ACSL at the moment to do we're rewriting or doing a new version for the safeguarding guide for for Catholic entities and organisations. One of the areas, of course, we're looking at now is adults at risk, and I guess trying to make the material accessible to all people, including volunteers. So I guess the language becomes fairly important, how you make it accessible in a way that can relate their everyday experience and decisions they have to make, particularly about when we look at adults at risk, and we might be talking about younger. We were looking at a case study, for example, trying to look at young adults that might have some sort of diminished or sort of some intellectual disabilities. And I suppose trying to sort of give some case studies about how do you still reflect and adhere to the concept of dignity and autonomy when we were looking at an example of, I guess, a sort of the online social media environment and what younger adults may be experienced too, but you don't want to completely reduce their inability to be part of the world that they live in. I just wonder if you've got any thoughts on sort of language and ability to be able to connect with, just those everyday experiences.
So there's a couple of things that come to mind. The first of them, and it's not so much the language question, it's more a positioning issue, is, as I was trying to do, is to recognise that both things are important, both the respect of the dignity or autonomy and the application of the framework. It's not as if one suddenly drops out of view because of the other, that this is about trying to find the best possible balance, which means it requires discernment in that sense. Now, that's probably not a word I would use either, because I think notions of discernment are probably less familiar than in most contexts than the case. What does tend to work is if you can provide little vignettes of how these things were done. It'll probably be rare that they are a perfect representation of the circumstances of the individual reading it. But I think when they can see something of themselves in that situation, like there's one or two of them, they don't have to be massive case studies, so say more like vignettes, then you go for that. I do think that the earlier comment about language in terms of what will resonate with the audience, so knowing your audience is important there. So trying to find the way to express there, and I'm probably not the best person to ask about that, because I'm not familiar enough with the people who are going to be reading and applying this to do that. But it's those little tools that bring it to life, but also giving people the confidence. This is a different point. I should have said this perhaps earlier, but I think it's something to do with how you make it easier for people to apply these. So it depends upon whether or not reasons carry a particular weight within the context you operate, as opposed to compliance. So there are some things in the world where strict compliance is required, for example, in things like aviation safety and all the rest. There are other things, though, where if a person in good faith has exercised their best judgment and can give a very plausible account of how they applied the principle in this particular case, then even if they reach the decision which might be slightly different to what someone else further up the hierarchy or in another place would have done, that's acceptable, rather than it being directly conforming with a non-negotiable set of protocols or standards. Now, there may be some things which are non-negotiable, which you'll say, okay, we draw that kind of line in the sand. But if people know that their ability to bring their best judgment to bear in the circumstances is something that will be respected, and that if they have good enough reasons, they won't just be thrown out because it's a different kind of outcome, then I think that's important too. So how you communicate that, I think, in these areas is also good. Always remembering that I'm sort of putting this in that framing of saying, here we are where we've got an overarching obligation to recognise this intrinsic dignity within, and this other thing that we're trying to do as well within the kind of the safeguarding standards and that you've got. I hope that's not too muddled a response.
Thanks for that. Steve Fletcher, your hand was up as well before. Did you still want to jump in?
Yeah, just to say thank you, Simon, for that. Just that distinction between the moral and ethical. Sometimes the whole area of the moral, needing to be put out a framework of legislation and civil laws and regulations and so on to protect the human person. I wonder whether there's a tension also in our attempts in the church to kind of address, a kind of a shock and horror that we've had to the whole scandal of abuse in the church, almost an overreaction to the point where actually you can deteriorate another moral or ethical principle, which is, around persons being, they're innocent until proven guilty, all those kind of things that Terry Magom in Queensland worked so hard for to establish that. I think we become possibly in our attempts to address this abuse in the church, is we become very fact oriented, and there's not a lot of there's not a road back in terms of some of the stuff you've talked about here, in terms of ethical responses that people make. If you go back and ask them why they did what they did, the facts are the facts, and these are the consequences. There's no road back. Is that too of the where we are at the moment?
Is that too bleak a view? Look, it's where you are at the moment is a perfectly understandable response, partly a tactical response to what's happened, in that the wider society has demanded something of this kind. And what it recognises as an adequate response is often a very diminished type of thing, which is just about rules and regulations and compliance. In fact, if you look at most of what's done, how we respond to most risks and challenges, we do so on the basis of putting in regimes of compliance, which are basic rules and regulations. Now, we do this despite the fact that for the most part it doesn't work. At least it doesn't work to the extent that we think it does. So I've spent over 30 years working with the Defence Forces, who are the world's best managers of risk and performance, because if they get it wrong, they get killed or wounded. So you don't sort of play around with things in a theoretical sense. You look at what works. And they also have to perform. And the way they go about managing risk is not through endless compliance. They do lots of planning and things, but the thing which is most effective is the establishment of a culture where they go from what's called command intent to common intent. And they build this culture so that even in the most atrocious circumstances humans can ever find themselves in, they're still able to operate, because for all their planning and all the rest, there's a maximum from a German theoretician called von Clausewitz that no plan survives first contact with the enemy. So a lot of cultural formation is the major part. In the private sector, and I suspect particularly in places like the churches at the moment, they are very much in the compliance mode, which I understand and I think is essential. As I said, there are some things where you've got to be really clear about rules. But there's a risk in this, which is worth thinking on. So the first thing is, if you try to create a world in which no one can choose to do anything wrong, and let's suppose you were successful, which is, there are theoretical reasons why you can't actually create it, but you get a long way down the track, then inadvertently what you do is you create a world in which no one can choose to do anything right, because there is no choice anymore. It's simply a compliance function. You tick the box, you tick the box, you tick the box, you tick the box. And what we know is that if human beings do not practice making responsible decisions, then the capacity to do so is eroded. It's a bit like the world's best tennis player. If they never pick up a tennis racket and practice, no matter how much their latent skill is present, they won't be able to play to the same degree. And so what we tend to do is to create these systems in which we reduce the ability to practice making responsible choices. Another way of thinking about it is if I said as an objective for Australia that we were to be the straightest standing nation on earth, I could achieve that by putting every Australian in a plaster cast, where there we would stand, the straightest nation the world has ever seen. But inside that plaster cast, our muscles would wither away because they're not being used. And if there's any kind of crack or break in the cast, would fall over like a sack of jelly that we would have become. Now, there's an alternative model. That is to have a frame which has got some well-placed, extremely sharp points that if you lean too far one way or the other, they give you a jab and you straighten up. But where you spend more of the time standing on your own 2 feet, maintaining that core capacity. The challenge for the church and for others that have been through this is to say, what's the balance between the non-negotiable essential rules that are enforced through a compliant culture as opposed to an environment where people are required to make responsible choices with good reason, where they'll be defended for those, so that they never lose the capacity to do that. And why would you want that? Because eventually the rules run out, or they are silent, or they are in conflict, and you still wish to have preserved the capacity for the individual decision maker to have the skill set to draw upon to make a decision even in those circumstances. Now, I don't know if that answers particularly the question, but that's the kind of challenge there, to say it's not all one or the other, but it's that prudent judgment as to how that balance lies, which is the essential question for the church at this point.
Thanks, Simon. Suzanne, you had your hand raised.
Indeed. Thank you, Simon, for explaining that in that last discourse between the compliance and culture and decision making is exactly what I've wanted to hear. I think we spend way too much time, and may I say it, from the the ACSL or yes, defining the detail without actually recognizing that the implementation has to happen at a local level. And it's only if you've had those practices looking at what are we doing in response to the things that we're told to do, that we just don't have the practice. We don't have the ability to recognize those risks. And so my encouragement, which I put in the chat, is to actually make sure that every local level works mostly not on redefining those high level things, but looking at their own practices. What do they do with respect to the things they do in the places they do it in? Call it a risk management or risk assessment, that you're actually looking at those risks and that you look at your own practices and how to minimize those risks. And the other thing I would strongly encourage is making sure that we've got a reflective practice on a very regular basis. And I never see that written down. It's incorporating that examination of life into that overarching, this is how you do it, or as you might describe it, those sharp points that say, if you're leaning the wrong way, this is where you need to change it. So thank you.
Thank you. No, thank you, Suzanne, for that affirmation and good guidance too. Yes, it's that reflective practice. It's also so that people don't misunderstand what can go wrong. This process of wondering about things is not just in relation to statements and rules, but it's also the way in which embedded systems, policies and practices within an organisation can send mixed messages about what's really important. So you saw it during the Royal Commission looking in the banking industry. You've got all these people saying, oh, look, customers are really important. And yet you heard the poor people on the stand saying, actually, the only thing that they cared about was measuring how much we sold. And so we thought they were hypocrites, and you can be a leader of an organisation saying and doing all the right things, fighting over systems, policies and structures that drive people to do the exact opposite and not realise how damaging that is. So that's the first thing I'd say, that reflective practice needs to be critically assessing not just the individual words and deeds of people, but also saying, what message does this system, this policy, this structure send about what's important, and is it consistent with what we claim? The second thing that comes from what you said, Suzanne, is I think it's quite a useful tool to train one's intuition by practicing. So if I go to an analogy with when we learn to drive a motor vehicle, everybody who learns to drive is taught that when you're heading towards danger, you put your foot on the brake. Now, that's the worst thing you can do when you're in a skid on an icy road or a muddy track. Instead, you have to do a counterintuitive thing, which is gently accelerate out of the skid. If you throw your foot on the brake, you're gone, over the cliff into the tree. Now, how do you learn to do that counterintuitive thing? You get on a skid pad, you practice, and progressively you learn to do that. So your intuitive, instinctive response is well-formed, well-educated, a bit like the Aquinas idea of a well-formed conscience. So here, what you should be thinking about is, how do we build into our practice the equivalent of an ethical skid pad? When a case of dignity might come up against a rule or something, how do we practice that so that our intuition is refined over time? And I think those sorts of exercises build into part of the the process of formation and ongoing life within this kind of reflective practice is a useful tool to develop as well.
Thanks, Simon. Maria, you've got your hand up again.
Thank you. Sorry, I don't want to hold to Simon, but I just wanted to state, Simon, that the way you've very eloquently talked about the difference between what I call the macro and the micro, but the compliance versus the practice is for me the reason we're here today. And I sit on the ACSL board, but I spent my life working, and I love in constructive subversion, because I've taught social work students and I've worked in child protection and family violence. And what you stated, and I hope I'm correct in, I'm not saying anything I shouldn't be, Ursula, but is exactly where the board is. Compliance has had to be progressed because we live in a totally risk-averse world. But we've been very aware that the culture needs to change, and the culture can only change because people are doing things differently. I'm reminded also very briefly about with Neville Owen's statement with the HIH inquiry. The main comment he made at the end is nobody asked the question, what is the right thing to do? And what he was really saying is the culture hadn't grown that at all. So we're in a perfect position to do what Peter is doing, which is to develop thinking processes and scenarios which help that culture. That's all I want.
And thank you. And that's why, to reiterate, I'm not a great fan of the so-called speak-up culture people try and advocate, because it sounds dangerous and it's only when there's something wrong. Let's do something much more interesting, which is encourage a culture of curiosity.
Absolutely.
Why do we do this? And if the practice is not actually consistent with and referable to one of your core values and principles and your purpose, and in other words, that's the thing, that your values and principles must be the standard for all judgment. If this rule, if this process, if this structure is not a reflection, an expression of the core values and principles, and believe me, both elements, I'm not sure how it stands here with you, but you see some organisations that only have values and they don't have principles, they don't understand the difference, and they go off the rails. You need both values and principles. You need to be able to articulate them, and then, as I say, they become the standard for judgment. And unless you've got that, then and you can have this curiosity about whether the things you do routinely or whether your embedded practices and structures and all the rest are consistent with it, then you won't get there. The great thing about curiosity, it doesn't have to be about bad things. Like, it's just like wondering, why we say this, but why do we do that? Or how come we've done this? I mean, that's such a lovely thing to be able to do if it's welcomed and celebrated by all.
Thank you.
Okay, was there anything anyone else wanted to raise? Got a couple more minutes if there was anything. No? Well, I mean, in that case, Simon, is there anything else you wanted to finish up in closing, or?
No, it's really just to thank you, to recognise it's very, very difficult at the moment, particularly for what you've gone through to get this right, that it's not just a simple matter of saying it and letting it happen. There are genuine tensions. The good thing is that I think, though, that you should be hopeful about it. This is all possible. It's all doable. It just requires that element of moral courage that is one of the essential attributes of the constructively subversive leader, which I know you all are.
Thanks, Simon. Well, I mean, I want to thank you, because that was a really interesting session, a lot more philosophical than I originally thought it was going to be, but it really raises.
You ask a philosopher, what do you expect to get?
To be honest, I don't know. I wasn't expecting the philosophy, but I really liked it. I liked the thinking. I really liked what you were talking about the role of leaders and their role to actually challenge some of those accepted customs and norms, and how we can do that honestly, I really love the idea of an ethical skid pad. That has a really good ring to it, and I think I'm going to steal that phrase, and we're going to find a way to embed that one too. But yeah, I just wanted to say thank you. I'm sure everyone else like me felt that was a really interesting and engaging process. So thank you for that. And lastly, just going to drop a little thing for us for our next webinar. Our next webinar is on the 22nd of March, and it's going to be presented by Robert Fitzgerald, New South Wales Disabilities Commissioner, and it's a focus on safeguarding for older people and people with disabilities. So if anyone's interested in jumping along to that one, have a look on Acorn. You can register and come along to that one as well. And I think Ursula just wants to jump in at the end there as well.
Oh, thank you, Karen. Sam, and I just wanted to say thank you on behalf of us all for a really stimulating session. I don't know that anyone came with preconceived ideas of what we were going to get from today, but one of the things that we all know is that, as Suzanne actually highlighted, we all need the time to have this reflection, and this was a wonderful opportunity. So thank you very much, and I hope that you are happy for us to cut and paste some of these lovely little vignettes of your presentation into some of our other training. So thank you very much. Thank you everyone for participating and supporting ACSL. We believe that we're here to support you in your work, and we want to make sure that we're doing the best thing that we can to do that. So thank you, Simon.
Okay, thanks, Ursula, and bye all.
Yes, thank you everyone.